In the Middle Ages, boys weren't simply trained to read scripture or ride a horse into battle. They were trained in the art of living. They were taught where and when to relieve themselves, how to stand while doing it, how to clean afterward, when to wash their hands, even how to sit at a meal without embarrassing themselves. Quick pause. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. It's always fascinating to see how far across the world these little glimpses into medieval life are reaching. Because in a world without plumbing, privacy, or toilet paper, even the most basic acts were judged. Cleanliness was far more than hygiene. It was discipline. It was morality. It was class. In 13th century England, a work called Urbanus Magnus, the Book of Courtesy, became a manual for noble boys. This wasn't a dusty rulebook but a long poem, thousands of lines of careful instruction teaching boys not only how to speak and eat, but how to bathe, how to spit, and yes, how to relieve themselves with dignity. Its author, likely Daniel of Beccles, didn't laugh at these topics. He considered them essential to raising a proper young man. Because in the medieval mind, shaping a boy into a man of standing meant shaping not only his words but his body, his gestures, even the way he breathed. Cleanliness wasn't simply about avoiding disease. It was about showing self-control, respect for others, and a readiness to take one's place among peers. Boys were taught when to spit, where to blow their nose, and how to pass wind quietly so as not to shame themselves in company. Underneath the rhyming verses was a serious lesson. A boy who can master his body would one day be able to master his temper, his household, and even other men. And these weren't just lessons for the sons of knights and lords. Even in humbler cottages, mothers, priests, and elders passed down the same wisdom by word of mouth. The message was clear: your body speaks before your tongue ever does. To us today, these rules might seem quaint, even amusing, but to a medieval boy, they were survival skills, a moral compass to follow. One of the very first lessons in Urbanus Magnus instructed, before you eat, relieve yourself. When hunger calls you to dine, it says, go first to the privy and empty what is behind. This was not merely a matter of comfort. It was order. The body must be emptied before it is filled. A boy who ignored this could disrupt the meal or worse, offend a guest or lord, a mistake that could shame his whole household. Afterward, he was expected to wash his hands, always with warm water, always with a clean towel, and never in water someone else had already used. Servants would prepare basins and towels before the meal began. A boy who sat down with dirty hands was not simply impolite. He marked himself as poorly bred. These rituals shaped a young man long before he ever saw battle or stood before a king. They taught that timing, control, and awareness of others were as important as courage. In the medieval mind, digestion wasn't just physical, it was social. Control of appetite began with control of the body. Even urination carried rules of hierarchy. According to Urbanus Magnus, not everyone was allowed to relieve themselves in the same place. The master of the house had his own designated latrine inside. Guests could use it, but only at night and only if they truly had to. Servants and messengers were expected to go outside. This wasn't simply about sanitation, it was about status. Privacy was a privilege. Most noble homes had a garderobe, a latrine built into the castle wall, where waste dropped into the moat below. A boy's first lesson in modesty was knowing where and when to go. Peasants, by contrast, used fields, ditches, or the edges of woods, far from the home. In towns, chamber pots were common, but they had to be emptied quickly and never near guests or doorways. Tossing waste into the street was allowed, but if done carelessly, it could bring punishment or a fine. Teaching a boy where and how to pee was not crude, it was civilizing. It set boundaries, both social and moral. A noble child was reminded, do not stand too close to another, do not face him, do not make noise. These instructions were whispered in hallways, carved into memory by repetition, and enforced by sharp looks from elders. Because relieving oneself without shame was, in a way, the very first test of restraint. A medieval boy's body was seen as the proving ground of his soul. At the table, he was expected to sit straight, chew quietly, and above all, contain his wind. Burping loudly or passing gas was not just impolite, it was proof that you lacked discipline. Urbanus Magnus is blunt. Hold in your wind. To fail was to fail in manners, and in the medieval world, manners were everything. Don't let it fly, the old manuals warned, lest every head turn to you in disgust. If a boy felt a burp coming on, he wasn't allowed to just let it escape. He was taught to turn his head slightly aside, lift his eyes toward the rafters, and let it out as discreetly as possible. A cough had to be stifled into the sleeve, and sneezing into one's hand or clothing was frowned upon unless there was no other choice. Ideally, a cloth or kerchief should always be at hand, the mark of a well-prepared young gentleman. But nothing was trickier than flatulence. This was the great test of composure. If it could not be held back, a boy was expected to excuse himself quietly, step aside, and return without drawing attention. To us, this might sound excessive, but to them, these lessons were not about etiquette alone. They were about character. A quiet stomach was seen as proof of a quiet mind. A boy who could master his body was believed capable of mastering his impulses, his temper, even his destiny. And so these lessons began early. Boys were watched carefully at the table, especially in front of guests or senior men. One slip could bring laughter, mockery, or lasting shame. Repetition was everything, and over time, habit turned into instinct, and instinct became reputation. In a world without perfumes or fans to hide unpleasant smells, a gentleman was known not only by what he said, but by how he smelled, how he carried himself, and even how he breathed. Cleanliness, in the medieval sense, wasn't about killing germs. It was about ritual, dignity, and control. Boys were instructed to wash not just their hands, but their faces, necks, and even the backs of their ears before sitting down to eat. Urbanus Magnus was strict. The water must be warm, the towel must be white, and the process must be done carefully, not lazily. To dip one's hands into dirty water or use a foul basin was an insult, not just to oneself but to the host. A well-mannered boy refused it, not from vanity, but from self-respect. Hair had to be combed smooth, free of lice and straw if possible. Nails were to be trimmed, rounded, and scrubbed clean beneath. A single dirty nail could ruin even the finest tunic or polished boots. In wealthier homes, bowls of water were carried from guest to guest, each washing in turn before the meal began. In humbler houses, washing took place at a basin by the hearth or in the courtyard. But the rule was the same. No hand touches bread until it is clean. Even in the dead of winter, when water had to be warmed over the fire or snow rubbed on stiff fingers, a boy was expected to do it. Refusing to wash was not merely laziness. It was a sign of moral failure, a mark of a boy who could not govern himself. When soap was rare and full baths were taken only a handful of times a year, these small rituals of washing became acts of spiritual and social order. For noble boys, grooming began almost as soon as they could stand on a stool and see themselves in polished metal. An unruly beard or wild hair was not seen as charming but as a threat to order. Urbanus Magnus lists grooming as a moral duty. The beard must be trimmed, nose hairs plucked, nails clipped, breath cleansed with herbs or rinsing. This was not mere vanity. In a world where status was read in behavior, even a stray hair could invite whispers. Medieval boys were told to look at their own reflection, not to admire beauty, but to check for disorder. Their reflection was proof of their discipline. Picking one's nose in public was unthinkable. Scratching the scalp, poking at teeth, or fiddling with clothing at the table was forbidden. If an itch needed scratching, the boy was to excuse himself. If he cut himself while shaving, he was to hide the evidence. Servants might help with grooming, but the responsibility rested with the boy. He was expected to wake early, wash, comb, and present himself without being reminded. To neglect these duties was to forget one's place. A dirty face meant a careless spirit. A noble boy who ignored his appearance could easily be mistaken for a peasant. And in a world where appearances shaped your destiny, that mistake could stain a reputation forever. When night fell, etiquette did not sleep. Boys often shared quarters, sometimes several to a room, and chamber pots were kept close by. But using them came with rules. Boys were told, "Do not wake the others, do not make noise, and do not leave a mess." Even a single splash could mark you as careless. If he had to relieve himself in the dark, he was expected to rise quietly, step lightly, and return without disturbing anyone. No whispering, no lingering, no smell left behind. At dawn, servants might empty the pots, but in some houses, the boys were required to do it themselves. Either way, silence and discretion were part of the training. Bed linens had to be kept clean, and accidents at night were handled with shame and immediate washing. A boy who wet the bed too often risked scolding or being branded weak-willed. Before sleep, he was expected to dust off his clothes, wash his hands, and say his prayers. Even in darkness, cleanliness was tied to virtue. A body at rest should not offend the senses of others. In a cold, silent dormitory, one careless sound could echo louder than a church bell. In the medieval world, dirt was never just dirt. It was a sign of disorder, danger, and disgrace. A boy who was clean was assumed to be disciplined, obedient, and properly raised. A boy who could one day command respect. A boy who stayed dirty, who was lazy, wild, or careless was seen as more than untidy. He was thought to be cursed by disorder itself. Even among peasants, where dirt was part of daily life, appearances still mattered. A bit of mud on the cheek after a day in the fields could be forgiven. But a stench that lingered, foul breath that turned stomachs, those left an impression that lasted. Servants were expected to wash frequently, even though their work meant they would only get dirty again. A kitchen boy might sweat beside the ovens from dawn until dusk, but he was still required to scrub his face and hands before carrying bread to the table. And in noble households, the rules were even stricter. A young page who came before his lord unkempt could lose favor in an instant. Nobles had more resources to stay clean. Scented water kept in bronze basins, combs carved from ivory, linen towels, herbal mouth rinses. But these luxuries came with higher expectations. The higher one's station, the fewer excuses were accepted for grime or bad smell. A boy wearing fine wool and silk but showing dirty nails or greasy hair was judged more harshly than a barefoot farm child, because he was expected to know better. Cleanliness was not simply a matter of health, it was a symbol of order. It meant the boy had been taught, corrected, and cared for. It showed that he knew his place and carried himself accordingly. Even priests used the language of hygiene as metaphor. Wash your body as you would wash your soul. They reminded boys that cleanliness was not for vanity or shallow beauty, but because a clean body reflected a spirit worthy of service, to family, to faith, to crown. So, boys scrubbed their fingers until the nails shone, plucked stray hairs, folded their towels neatly, not to boast, but to belong. To us, this careful training might seem strict, even excessive. But in the Middle Ages, hygiene was never just about staying healthy. It was about order, the order of the body, the home, the hall, and even the kingdom. A boy who knew when to wash, how to sit, and where to relieve himself was seen as a boy who could obey. And obedience was the foundation of service, of loyalty, of leadership. Discipline of the body became discipline of the spirit. If a boy could control a sneeze at the table, perhaps he could one day control his temper in the hall. If he could hold back a burp, perhaps he could one day hold his ground before a king or a lord without faltering. Every act of washing, every careful gesture reinforced a hierarchy. Child beneath parent, servant beneath master, soul beneath God. Boys were not merely taught hygiene. They were being rehearsed for a lifetime of discipline. Even the whispered rules about waste and privy use reflected this belief. To lose control of the body was seen as losing control of the soul. A boy who disgraced himself in the privy might one day disgrace himself on the battlefield. And so, these lessons were planted early, repeated often, wrapped in rhymes, prayers, and quiet correction. Because one did not simply become a man by growing tall. Manhood was something earned, learned in the rhythm of daily rituals. When to spit, when to shave, how to bow, how to excuse oneself with dignity. Today, we use charts, books, and routines to teach children these same habits. But in the medieval world, the lessons were passed through poetry, by watchful parents, by servants, and by sharp looks across the hall. Behind every shining knight we read about in history stood a boy who had once been taught to sit still, to wash his hands even in winter, to wipe well and leave no trace. A boy corrected not only with words, but with glances, silences, and, when needed, a splash of cold water. And though many of those strict rules have faded, the core ideas remain. We still teach children not to speak with their mouths full, to excuse themselves before leaving the table, to wash their hands and keep their nails trimmed. Because even now, we instinctively understand what the medieval world knew well. The body speaks before the mouth ever does. Cleanliness, even now, is more than just a matter of health. It's a declaration of readiness, of self-respect, and respect for those around us. Imagine being a boy in the Middle Ages, no running water, no soap as we know it, and very little privacy. And yet, he was taught patiently over and over to care for what little he had, his hands, his breath, and most importantly, his dignity. And that leaves us with a quiet but powerful truth that bridges centuries. Before a boy ever spoke his first words, before he was trusted with a sword, a plow, or a pen, he was judged by how he smelled, how he carried himself, and whether he left the world a little cleaner than he found it. Even in a world of mud, sweat, and grime, cleanliness was not about pretending the world was pure. It was about keeping the soul pure. Washing was an act of discipline, a way to say, I am ready, I am honorable. And maybe, just maybe, that same lesson still lingers with us today, in how we get ready for work, how we teach our kids to wash up, and how we quietly declare through our appearance who we are. What do you think? Was medieval cleanliness more about survival, or about teaching discipline and pride? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear how you see this forgotten part of daily life. If you enjoyed this glimpse into the small but meaningful rituals of the Middle Ages, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Vassal Truths. Together, we'll keep uncovering the hidden habits, customs, and stories that shaped the world, and still shape us today. Ring the notification bell so you never miss the next journey into the past. Stay curious, because sometimes it's the smallest details that tell the biggest stories.